For nearly 200 years, the story of how Germany became populated was told through one dramatic image: enormous Germanic tribes crossing the Roman frontier, sweeping southward in powerful waves, defeating Roman armies, replacing older populations, and planting the ancestral foundation of modern Germany in one decisive movement. It was a story of warriors, collapsing borders, burning settlements, and entire peoples supposedly moving together from one homeland into another. The 19th century loved this vision because European nationalism was searching for heroic ancient origins, and German historians and artists often imagined the Germanic past as a unified world of tribes standing outside Rome, waiting for the empire to weaken. Later, this narrative was distorted into a much darker racial mythology, particularly under Nazi ideology, which attempted to transform ancient Germanic history into supposed evidence for racial purity and an unbroken Aryan bloodline. But archaeology and historical scholarship had already been questioning this simple migration model for decades. Now, ancient DNA has provided another way to test the story. In 2026, researchers published a major Nature study analyzing 258 newly generated ancient genomes from the former Roman frontier in southern Germany, dating between about 400 and 700 CE, and compared them with more than 2,500 additional ancient genomes and 379 modern genomes. The result did not show a simple population replacement. Instead, the researchers found a major demographic reorganization around the late 5th century, when people carrying Northern European ancestry mixed with genetically diverse populations connected to Roman provincial communities. Family relationships continued across the transition, and the resulting population gradually came to resemble modern Central Europeans. The old invasion story was not completely true. What happened was far more complicated, slower, and more human. To understand why this discovery matters, we need to go back to the world that existed before the Roman Empire collapsed. Southern Germany was not a blank landscape waiting for Germanic tribes to arrive. For centuries, this region had been connected to the Roman frontier, or limes, a complicated zone where military installations, rural settlements, traders, farmers, soldiers, administrators, and migrants interacted. Rome did not simply create a wall and keep everyone outside. Its frontier was porous. People crossed it for trade, military service, migration, diplomacy, labor, and family reasons. Roman influence extended far beyond military forts. Roads connected settlements. Markets connected communities. Coins, pottery, weapons, agricultural techniques, religious practices, and Roman administrative habits moved across the frontier. People from outside the empire could become soldiers or traders, while people born inside Roman territories could move north or east. This means that even before the 5th century, the population of southern Germany already contained people with different ancestry and cultural backgrounds. The idea of a completely Roman population on one side and a completely Germanic population on the other is therefore misleading. The frontier was more like a zone of interaction than an absolute border. This becomes important because when researchers examine the DNA of individuals living around the period of Rome's collapse, they do not see one homogeneous population suddenly being replaced. They see people whose ancestry already reflects centuries of movement. The political border was real, but the biological and social border was much less rigid. The new 2026 study makes this point especially powerful because it shows that population mobility was already occurring before Rome's political authority finally disappeared. The study focuses on a period that historians often call Late Antiquity and the early Middle Ages, roughly from the 4th through the 7th centuries. This was one of the most dramatic transitions in European history. The Western Roman Empire faced political instability, military pressure, economic disruption, changing trade networks, and shifting relationships between Roman authorities and populations outside the empire. In 476 CE, the traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Germanic military leader Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus in Italy. But the collapse of imperial rule did not mean that Roman society suddenly disappeared everywhere. In many regions, Roman institutions weakened gradually. Local elites continued to operate. Agricultural communities survived. Roads and settlements remained active. Christian traditions expanded. New political kingdoms emerged. In other words, the transition was not one day when Rome ended and another day when Germany began. It was a long process in which political structures changed while ordinary people continued living their lives. The ancient DNA confirms this more complicated reality. The major demographic shift identified in southern Germany appears around the later 5th century, roughly corresponding to the collapse of Roman state structures in the region. But the researchers found evidence of continuing family structures and intermarriage rather than a complete replacement of the population. This means political transformation and biological transformation were connected, but they were not identical events. Governments can collapse faster than populations change. A kingdom can disappear in one generation, while families remain in the same landscape for many generations. The DNA reveals exactly that kind of continuity. The researchers did not simply sequence a handful of famous warriors. They analyzed people buried in ordinary archaeological cemeteries, especially the furnished row grave cemeteries that became common across parts of Western and Central Europe from about the middle of the 5th century onward. These cemeteries are extremely valuable because they provide information about everyday communities rather than only elite monuments. Graves may contain weapons, jewelry, clothing accessories, tools, vessels, and other objects that archaeologists use to understand social identity. But grave goods can be misleading if interpreted too literally. A person buried with a certain style of weapon does not necessarily mean they belong to a completely separate ethnic population. Cultural objects can travel. Fashion can spread. People can adopt the customs of their neighbors. A sword may indicate status, occupation, social identity, or regional fashion rather than biological ancestry. This is precisely where ancient DNA becomes powerful. By comparing the ancestry of people buried with similar or different grave goods, scientists can test whether archaeological categories correspond to genuine population differences. In the new Southern German study, the genetic data showed that the societies associated with row grave cemeteries were genetically mixed. Instead of one uniform Germanic population appearing suddenly, researchers found different ancestral components combining over time. The cemeteries therefore represent communities formed through interaction rather than biological isolation. The same grave could contain cultural traditions associated with different populations. That tells us something important about identity itself. People in the early medieval world could adopt new customs without completely changing their ancestry. Culture could move faster than genes. One of the most important discoveries came from the earliest individuals in the study, those living during the period from roughly 400 to 470 CE. These people were associated with the northern frontier of the Roman Empire and showed ancestry similar to Iron Age northern Europeans, with genetic affinities, especially close to populations connected with northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. That might sound like evidence for the old migration story, but the timing changes the interpretation. These individuals were already present before the full collapse of Roman structures. They were not necessarily arriving as part of one giant invasion after Rome had fallen. Instead, the researchers argue that people with Northern European ancestry had been moving southward in smaller numbers and gradually integrating with local Roman provincial communities. Some could have been migrants. Some may have been descendants of earlier migrants. Some may have entered through military service or other forms of mobility. The important point is that Northern ancestry was already present during the Roman period, before the dramatic political changes of the late 5th century. This means the demographic transformation that followed was not the beginning of contact. It was an acceleration and reorganization of processes that had already been happening. The old model imagined a massive wave arriving at once. The genetic record looks more like a stream that had been flowing for generations and then changed direction and volume as the political landscape transformed around it. That is a fundamentally different explanation for how Central European populations formed. Then comes the major demographic turning point around the late 5th century. The nature study found that people with ancestry associated with Roman provincial populations began moving into the hinterland and appearing across the row grave cemeteries of southern Germany. This suggests that the collapse of Roman structures weakened some of the institutions that had previously tied rural communities to specific settlements and economic systems. As those political structures weakened, people became more mobile. Some moved from Roman settlements into newly developing rural communities. Others may have moved between regions. Some long-distance movement probably occurred in individual cases or small groups, but the researchers emphasize that large-scale migrations are not necessary to explain the overall genetic pattern that emerged. This is one of the most important corrections to the old Völkerwanderung model. The population changed substantially, but the transformation did not require hundreds of thousands of people marching across Europe as unified tribes. Small movements accumulated into large demographic effects. Imagine a village receiving 5 new families every few years, rather than one army arriving and replacing everyone. After several generations, the genetic composition of the village could look very different, even though no single dramatic invasion ever occurred. This is exactly the kind of slow transformation the new evidence supports. It also explains why political events can appear dramatic in historical records, while the genetic consequences are gradual. Kings can be replaced overnight. Populations change one birth, marriage, and migration at a time. Family reconstruction provides perhaps the most human part of the discovery. Scientists were able to identify relatives among individuals buried in these communities and reconstruct family relationships that extended across generations. Instead of seeing a cemetery as a collection of unrelated skeletons, the researchers could recognize family groups. This revealed continuity through the transition from the Roman to the early medieval world. People were not simply disappearing and being replaced. Families persisted. Children inherited ancestry from both parents. Communities absorbed new people. Marriages link different genetic backgrounds. This matters because older interpretations of early medieval society often imagined large patriarchal kin groups organized around powerful tribal clans. The genetic data suggests something more ordinary and recognizable. Many households were built around relatively small family units. Researchers found evidence consistent with nuclear family structures, widespread intermarriage, and avoidance of close kin unions. That does not mean extended families did not exist socially, but it shows that biological relationships within these communities can be described at the level of parents, children, siblings, and more distant relatives. In other words, the people who lived through the fall of Rome were not simply members of an abstract tribe. They were families. They had parents, they had children, they had cousins. They married people from other backgrounds. They buried their dead, and they continued building lives even while the political system surrounding them transformed. Ancient DNA has a way of turning large historical events back into human stories. The discovery of widespread intermarriage is particularly important because it challenges the idea that ancestry and cultural identity were the same thing. The people living in southern Germany during this period could carry different genetic ancestries while sharing the same cultural traditions. A person with Northern European ancestry could be buried in a Roman-influenced context. Someone with ancestry linked to Roman provincial populations could be buried with objects associated with the emerging early medieval culture. This means archaeology and genetics cannot be treated as interchangeable. A grave style is not a DNA test. A weapon is not a passport. Clothing does not prove ethnicity. Instead, each source tells us something different. Genetics tells us about biological ancestry and relationships. Archaeology tells us about material culture and behavior. Historical texts tell us how ancient observers describe political groups, although those descriptions have their own biases. By combining all three, researchers can reconstruct a much more accurate picture. In the new study, the genetic evidence reveals that cultural boundaries were more flexible than older models assumed. People could participate in a new society without being genetically replaced by a completely different population. The early medieval world was therefore a place of cultural fusion, not just territorial conquest. The older idea of Germanic tribes also becomes problematic once we look closely at what tribe actually means. Ancient authors used names such as Alemanni, Franks, Goths, Burgundians, Vandals, and others, but those names did not necessarily describe genetically homogeneous populations. A political confederation could include people from different origins. Groups could change size and membership. Leaders could attract followers from neighboring communities. Alliances could create new identities. The Alemanni are a good example. The name probably refers to a confederation of multiple groups, rather than a single biological tribe, stretching back unchanged into prehistory. The word itself is often interpreted as relating to all men or all people, reflecting the possibility that the confederation represented the joining of different groups. This fits the genetic evidence surprisingly well. Instead of one ancient Alemannic population moving south as a unit, the evidence points toward a mixed community forming over time through migration and integration. Political identities could emerge after genetic mixing had already begun. In other words, people could become Alemanni without all descending from the same ancient ancestors. Identity was something they participated in, not simply something written in their chromosomes. The research also has something to say about women, and this may be one of the most overlooked parts of the story. Genetic evidence from early medieval sites, including the famous Niederstotzingen cemetery, has shown that population movement was often sex-biased. In some communities, women appear to have moved more frequently between populations than men, while in other contexts, the opposite pattern may occur. At Niederstotzingen, researchers used ancient DNA to reconstruct family relationships among 13 individuals buried with rich grave goods and found multiple mitochondrial lineages and different paternal lineages. The combination of genetic ancestry and burial practices suggested a complex community that could not be reduced to one simple family or warband. Such findings challenged the old stereotype that early Germanic migration was dominated entirely by male warriors marching together into new territory. Women were also moving. They were marrying into new communities. They were transmitting mitochondrial DNA. They were connecting families across regions. Their movement helped create the genetic landscape of early medieval Europe. Ancient DNA gives women a visibility that many written sources deny them. A chronicle might mention a king or warrior by name while saying nothing about the women who moved with them, married into new communities, raised children, and passed ancestry to future generations. Genetics can reveal their presence indirectly through descendants. Another fascinating discovery from this period involves deliberate head shaping. Archaeologists have found some individuals in early medieval Europe with elongated skulls created through artificial cranial modification during infancy. This practice has been associated with communities farther east, including groups connected with steppe populations and the Hunnic world. When individuals with artificially shaped skulls appear in Central European burial sites, they provide physical evidence of cultural contact and movement. But again, the genetic picture matters. A person with an Eastern cultural practice may not have entirely Eastern ancestry. They may have local ancestry, but adopted a fashion or custom associated with migrants. Or they may actually have migrated from another region and joined a local community. Without DNA, archaeologists can sometimes identify the practice, but not its demographic mechanism. With DNA, they can ask whether the individual's ancestry matches the local population or points elsewhere. This distinction is crucial. Cultural traits can spread without large population movement. Genetic ancestry can spread without every cultural trait spreading with it. The combination of evidence therefore allows scientists to separate cultural diffusion from migration. That is one of the reasons ancient genomics has transformed archaeology so dramatically. It does not replace traditional archaeology. It allows archaeologists to ask much more precise questions. The role of Rome itself also deserves reconsideration. The empire's collapse did not erase Roman ancestry. People associated with Roman towns and forts did not simply vanish. Many remained where they were. Others moved into rural settlements. Some joined new political communities. Some married migrants. Roman culture itself persisted in Christianity, law, agriculture, architecture, language, and social practices. The new genetic evidence therefore supports a picture of continuity beneath political change. The Western Roman Empire disappeared as a political structure, but many of the people living inside it remained. Their descendants became part of the early medieval populations that followed. This is why calling the period simply the fall of Rome can be misleading. Rome fell politically, but the population did not disappear. Roman ancestry continued. Roman traditions continued in altered forms. Roman roads remained, Roman towns were reused, Roman religious practices were transformed into medieval Christian structures. And now ancient DNA shows that Roman provincial populations themselves became part of the genetic foundation of Central Europe. The early medieval world was not created from nothing. It was built from the remains of the Roman world mixed with new migrants and local populations. This also changes the way we should think about the word invasion. An invasion is typically imagined as a large military operation involving organized forces entering another territory. Human migration is different. People move for many reasons. Some are fleeing conflict, some seek land, some follow economic opportunities. Some marry, some join armies, some become refugees. Some move only a few hundred kilometers. Others travel across continents. The New Southern German genetic record suggests that small group mobility was enough to reshape the population. That does not mean violence never occurred. Wars certainly happened. Roman frontier zones experienced conflict. Kingdoms fought over territory. But conflict and migration are not the same thing. A population can change genetically through thousands of small movements without requiring one massive invasion. The genetic evidence is therefore not saying nothing happened when Rome fell. It is saying the demographic mechanism was more complex than historians once assumed. There was movement. There was mixing. There was political collapse. There was social reorganization. But there was no need for a simple story in which one unified Germanic people arrived and replaced everyone. The study also provides a surprising bridge to modern Germany. Researchers compared the ancient genomes with modern individuals from hospitals in Munich and Kiel. The analyses showed that some of the north-south genetic structure visible in modern Germany was already emerging during the early medieval period. This does not mean modern Germans are genetically identical to people living there in the 6th century. Modern populations have experienced many additional migrations and demographic changes, but the finding indicates long-term regional continuity. The broad distinction between northern and southern German genetic patterns has roots deeper than the modern German state itself. The modern country of Germany was not established until the 19th century, but parts of its regional population structure were already taking shape more than 1,000 years earlier. This is an extraordinary example of how ancient DNA can reveal continuity across political transformations. Kingdoms disappear, borders move, states form and collapse, but population structure can persist across centuries. The DNA provides a biological thread, connecting early medieval communities with modern regional populations. At the same time, the study warns us not to imagine that modern Germans are descended directly from one ancient medieval group. Modern Central Europe experienced migrations throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period. Slavic migrations, medieval expansions, urbanization, wars, religious movements, and later industrial migration all changed the population. The ancient genomes represent one important chapter, not the entire book. Their significance lies in showing that a recognizable genetic structure was already forming during the transition from Roman to early medieval society. The modern pattern inherited part of that foundation and then continued evolving. This is how population history works. No generation starts from zero. Each one inherits the demographic consequences of earlier generations and then adds new ones. There is another reason this research is particularly meaningful in Germany. The country's modern identity was built much later than the communities whose DNA is being studied. The people buried between 400 and 700 CE did not think of themselves as modern Germans. The German national state did not exist. Their political identities were local, regional, tribal, royal, religious, or otherwise different from modern nationalism. This is important because it prevents modern political categories from being projected backward onto ancient populations. Calling 6th century people Germans is convenient for geography, but historically imprecise. They were inhabitants of a region that later became part of Germany, but their identities were more complex. Ancient DNA reinforces that point by showing that the population itself was mixed. There was no single biological German race waiting beneath the Roman frontier. Modern Germany emerged from many centuries of demographic and political change. The new genetic research simply allows us to see one part of that process in unprecedented detail. This also helps explain why 19th century national myths were so misleading. Nationalism tends to turn complex histories into simple origin stories. A modern nation wants an ancient ancestor. It wants a moment when our people appeared. It wants heroes, enemies, migrations, and founding events. But populations rarely cooperate with these narratives. People move gradually. They marry outsiders. They adopt languages. They change political identities. New groups absorb old groups. Ancient DNA is especially good at disrupting national myths because it measures biological relationships without caring about the political story attached to them. When scientists discover that a supposed Germanic cemetery contains people with multiple genetic ancestries, they cannot simply force those individuals into a 19th century category. The genome makes the complexity visible. That is one reason ancient DNA can sometimes feel politically powerful, even when the science itself is politically neutral. It challenges assumptions that people have been taught for generations. The lesson extends beyond Germany. Similar research across Europe has shown that dramatic historical events often produce gradual biological effects. Anglo-Saxon migrations into Britain did not completely replace the existing population everywhere. Viking expansion involved both migration and integration. The spread of farming was a combination of population movement and cultural adoption. The Roman Empire itself was full of migrants. Ancient societies were already cosmopolitan. Modern humans have been moving for as long as humans have existed. The idea of a pure population remaining in one place until another pure population arrives is usually a projection onto history rather than a description of history. Ancient DNA repeatedly reveals mixtures. The Southern German study is another powerful example. Its contribution is especially valuable because it focuses on ordinary communities during the exact period when the political structure of Rome changed dramatically. And perhaps the most interesting question is what life actually felt like for the people whose DNA now sits inside these databases. They probably did not wake up one morning thinking, Rome has fallen and a new ethnic population is replacing us. Political transformation is usually experienced locally. A farmer notices taxes changing. A soldier changes allegiance. A family moves to a more secure settlement. A woman marries someone from another region. A merchant travels to a new market. A child grows up speaking a language slightly different from their grandparents. A burial custom changes. Christianity becomes more visible. A new ruler collects taxes. A road becomes less maintained. Now, these small changes accumulate. After several generations, the society looks completely different. Ancient DNA reconstructs the biological side of that process. It shows which people remained related, which groups mixed, and how ancestry changed over time. The political story becomes a family story. One of the most remarkable findings is therefore not the ancestry shift itself, but the persistence of family structure during that shift. Even as populations changed, families continued to exist, marry, have children, and bury their relatives within recognizable communities. Genetic continuity suggests that demographic transformation happened through integration rather than complete replacement. This is one reason the study's title emphasizes demography and life histories, rather than simply migration. The researchers are not only asking where people came from, they're asking how they lived, who was related, who moved, who married whom, how did family networks survive political collapse. Those questions make ancient DNA more than a tool for identifying ethnic origins. It becomes a method for reconstructing human life. The answer emerging from southern Germany is therefore remarkably different from the old heroic migration myth. After Rome's decline, the population did change. People with Northern European ancestry were present before the formal collapse. Later, people associated with Roman provincial populations moved into the countryside. These populations mixed. New cemeteries appeared, family structures persisted, cultural practices blended, political identities changed. Over time, a population emerged that was genetically closer to modern Central Europeans. The process was real. The migration was real. The transformation was real. What changed was the scale and mechanism. Instead of one dramatic invasion, The evidence points to sustained mobility and integration by small groups over multiple generations. This does not make the period less fascinating. It makes it more fascinating because it replaces fantasy with detail. We can now see that ordinary people mattered. The collapse of Rome was not only a story about emperors, generals, and tribes, it was also a story about mothers, fathers, children, marriages, migration, and local communities. A family from a Roman provincial settlement could eventually become part of an early medieval rural population. A person from Northern Europe could move south and marry locally. A child could inherit ancestry from both worlds. A cemetery could contain the descendants of multiple populations living side by side. That is how modern Central Europe was built. Not by one nation arriving fully formed, but through centuries of interaction. And this is where the old myth finally breaks. There was no single moment when Germany was created. There was no single tribe that became the German people. There was no biological line separating Romans from Germans. There was no simple replacement of one population by another. There was movement, there was mixture, there was continuity, there was political collapse, there was cultural transformation, and there were families adapting to all of it. The DNA does not show us a world of pure tribes marching across a map. It shows us people moving one family at a time, people marrying, people migrating, people staying, people adapting, people becoming something new without completely losing what came before. That is why the 2026 Nature study matters so much. It is not simply another ancient DNA paper. It is a direct challenge to one of Europe's most persistent historical images. The Germanic migration period was real, but the old picture of massive unified tribes replacing a Roman population is too simple. The actual demographic process was much more gradual. Northern European ancestry was present before the Roman collapse. Roman provincial ancestry remained after it. The communities that formed afterward were genetically mixed, and by the early 7th century, the combined population was beginning to resemble the genetic landscape of Central Europe today. The final surprise is therefore not that the old story was completely false. It is that reality was more complicated. The people who built medieval Germany were not simply descendants of one migrating tribe. They were descendants of many populations, Romans and non-Romans, Northern Europeans and local provincial communities, migrants and people who never moved, men and women who crossed regional boundaries, families that stayed together through political upheaval, and children who inherited all of those histories at once. That is the real genetic story of Germany after Rome. Not a single invasion, not a single replacement, a transformation, a slow one, a human one. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is that the DNA did not preserve the myths people later created about these populations. It preserved the people themselves, their relationships, their movements, their families, their ancestry. And after more than 1,500 years, their descendants are still carrying part of that history. The empire disappeared, the tribes changed, the kingdoms rose, the borders moved, the language evolved. The nation came much later, but the people remained. And now for the first time, their DNA is allowing us to see how the world that became modern Germany was actually built. Not in one battle, not in one invasion, but generation by generation.